Chapter 8. A Master of Spirits. We now come to sketch the history of a series of events that tested Asbury's spirit and brought out his powers of mastery and leadership. But as for the distinct and crucial situation created by these events, it is doubtful if the providential mission of Asbury to the New World could have been so completely and effectively realized as it was. The conference of 1777 met in a country chapel at Deer Creek, in Harford County, Maryland, on the 20th day of May. Asbury and certain other members of the conference held an unofficial preliminary meeting at Perry Hall, the home of the Goths, at which the stationing of the preachers and other matters were discussed. Two important departures were proposed. One was a plan to have Rankin administer the ordinances, but this was similarly voted down. Another was that, in view of the almost certain early departure of Rankin and possibly of the other English preachers, a committee of American preachers should be appointed to superintend the societies when it should happen that no general assistant was on the ground. This was favorably considered, and the committee was regularly appointed by the conference. No account of this action appears in the printed minutes of the year, but a contemporaneous document supplies the record and also gives the names of the members of the committee. They were William Waters, Philip Gatch, Daniel Ruff, Edward Dromgoole, and William Glendenning. Thomas Rankin was present and presided, though he announced that both he and the other English brethren would soon take their departure for the mother country. For the use and protection, certificates of character were issued by the conference, but this did not include the name of Asbury, for he had already announced his purpose to remain with the Americans. Nevertheless, his recall by Wesley had not been revoked, and it was foreseen that the order to return might be renewed at any time. The American brethren urged that those English preachers who had been demitted should remain to the last moment. Accordingly, George Shadford and Martin Rhoda were given appointments, the one in Maryland and the other in Delaware. Rankin, as in the 2 previous years, gave himself to assignment. Neither does the name of Asbury appear in the station list. However, immediately after the conference, he rode to Annapolis and took up the work which became a part of the Baltimore circuit. The absence of Asbury's name from the list of appointments for this year has been a puzzle to the historians, but to me, the explanation is on the face of things. Rankin, expecting to leave the country at any time, arranged with Asbury, with whom he had come to an understanding, to take up the superintendency of the societies the moment he should depart. This can only explain why Asbury's name did not head the revisional committee. So long as Asbury should be on the ground, the commission plan was inoperative. Proof of this will appear later. The line of travel which Asbury laid out for himself indicates that he had already been admitted by Rankin to a joint superintendency, which was to become complete the moment Rankin took ship. This will also explain the frequent meetings of Asbury and Rankin during the remaining weeks of the latter's stay. It seems, too, that in August, Asbury insisted on Rankin's taking a 3 months' service in Baltimore. This suggestion could not have been made with any degree of seemliness unless some understanding had been on between them. Rankin had his reasons for declining to go to Baltimore, but they were not a denial of the right of Asbury to suggest the appointment. Within a month, Rankin was on the high seas, bound for England. Asbury now manifested the sign of a general assistant by widening his circuit. In a little while, it included the greater part of Maryland, and he was on the point of extending his oversight to other parts of the field when he learned that George Shadford, the last of the English preachers, besides himself, had embarked for Europe. This left the Baltimore circuit in a state of crying need. There was no course open to Asbury but to remain in Maryland and supply the lack. This he was proceeding to do when the Maryland officers informed him that he must take the oath of allegiance to the new state government. The punishment for failure to do so was extradition or imprisonment. Maryland did not accept the Articles of Federation until 1781, but from the first she demanded a strict loyalty from those within her borders. Asbury declined to naturalize. As a loyal Englishman, he could not, and as a minister, his conscience was against the oath. As a means of personal safety, he repaired to the state of Delaware, where no such oath was required, and where he hoped to live in peace as a non-juror. In this he was mistaken, and of course his work as general assistant was over until conditions changed. In Delaware, he found an asylum in the hospital home of Judge White of the Kent County Court of Common Pleas, who, though a high churchman, had long been a friend and admirer of the faithful evangelist. The White home came to be with him a place only second in his affections to Perry Hall. Here he was in practical exile for many months, though he managed to sally forth and preach in a 9-days circuit about the castle of his protector. He also held frequent meetings in the barn on the White estate, and it was in this same barn that he organized the movement which no doubt changed the whole history of American Methodism, and marked him as a man of marvelous foresight and leadership. Such leadership, however, as answers to no rule in books of military tactics and contradicts every precedent developed in the stories of the mighty. This man, who walked by faith, led his fellows captive by the same rule. Although he finally escaped bodily harm or arrest, he suffered not a few persecutions and was often in imminent danger from those who counted him an enemy of their country. He saw his noble host arrested and dragged away to prison, perhaps for his sake, and he was himself compelled to hide for a considerable time in a neighboring swamp to escape the hands of those who meant him evil. Others of the itinerants were not so fortunate. Several were imprisoned at Annapolis by the Maryland police. Hartley was beaten and cast into a dungeon. Freeborn Garretson was not only confined in jail, but was assaulted by a petty ex-judge and felled from his horse. Petticord was brutally assaulted and received wounds, the scars of which he carried to his grave. And yet another member of the conference lost an eye because of his zeal for the word. They suffered under false accusations of being Tories and sympathizers with royalty. This came to them because of Mr. Wesley's unwise pamphlet on the Stamp Act and the war. But notwithstanding all they suffered, not one was silenced or forgot that he served the Lord Christ. Oh, thought he did. Matthew 7:22-23 is an important one to consider. Same thing with 7:21. The test of Methodism was now at hand. The conference of 1778 met in Leesburg, Virginia. Of course, Asbury did not preside. He cannot even be present, it being impossible for him to cross the territory of Maryland, and indeed dangerous for him to venture far from the home of his protector. William Waters, the first named of the Provisional Committee, was appointed the previous year, and the first Native American admitted into the traveling connection, presided over the deliberations of the conference. Amongst those admitted on trial at Leesbury was James O'Keefe, a man of whom we shall have occasion to speak again as this narrative progresses. At the conference held in Deer Creek, the last over which Rankin presided, it had been resolved to lay the whole matter of ordinances over for the determination of the conference to be held at Leesbury. But still so uncertain were these itinerants of the ground upon which their issue was pitched that they again deferred action to the session of the conference to be held in the succeeding year in Fluvanna County, Georgia. Fluvanna County, Virginia. It is more than probable that this postponement was secured by Waters himself. His conservatism nearly approached that of the English preachers, and in the succeeding year he allied himself with Asbury and assisted in the defeat of the Sacramental party. The Leesbury Minutes make no mention of Asbury's name. His enforced inactivity put him in the ranks of a local preacher. The name of William Waters leads the list of assistants, and this made him the de facto head of the societies. In consequence of the war, the numbers in society had fallen off nearly 1,000, and the number of preachers had been considerably reduced. This was one of the few years in the history of American Methodism in which there has been recorded an actual loss. Though the conference adjourned, leaving the sacramental question where it had rested for a year, it soon began to be apparent that sentiment upon the subject was advancing. Waters and other conservatives saw that radical action would be taken at the conference to be held in 1779. Whether or not they communicated their fears to Asbury cannot now be stated with certainty. But though remote from the scene and in exile, Asbury gathered accurate information concerning the course of events and deeply meditated a plan for circumventing what had now passed beyond ordinary means of correction. In the meantime, Asbury was not idle as an itinerant, though without an appointment. Freeborn Garretson, who was an assistant on the Delaware Circuit, divided the work with him, and in all matters deferred to him as though he were the superior by appointment. He dared not go beyond the borders of Delaware, but was constantly visited by former comrades. And he kept his eye on the work from Pennsylvania to Virginia. His influence and the respect in which he was held were but little, if any, diminished by his long isolation. In fact, during this year, his ascendancy over the preachers of the northern stations became complete. His sufferings, his zeal, and the unexampled power of his ministry as a prisoner of Jesus Christ were known and testified all along the western shore. In some way, it was read by many that to him had been committed the book of the law and the leadership of the hosts to be. All those preachers under his immediate shadow were won away from the desire to break with Mr. Wesley and take up the administration of the sacraments. Those farther away from him, namely all those in Virginia, which now contained, with the stations in North Carolina, far more than half of all the members in society, as also a substantial majority of the preachers, were determined to follow the example of Strawbridge and administer the ordinances on the ground that Providence had supplied the necessary grant of authority. Foreseeing the course of the preachers in the South, Asbury called a conference of those itinerants stationed north of the Virginia line. He had seen the advantage of a before-conference caucus in 1777, and he no doubt at first meant that this meeting should be nothing more than such. But like Mr. Wesley, when he found that one wise step logically called for another, that other was taken without hesitancy. The plan for a caucus matured into a call for a conference. The session was held in the barn on the Judge White estate in Kent County, Delaware, April 28, 1777, exactly 3 weeks before the date appointed for this meeting of the regular conference in Fluvanna County, Virginia. Several reasons have been assigned for the calling of this little conference, or quasi-conference, as it has been styled by different historians. The most apparent was that Asbury could not attend the regular session held beyond the borders of Delaware, but reason given by Asbury himself was that the northern brethren might be prepared for the regular session, which is perhaps a franker reason than even honest Asbury meant to state. So well were these brethren prepared for the regular conference that practically none of them attended its sittings. The real reason for holding this northern conference was one of masterful strategy, namely to prevent a separation of the societies from Mr. Wesley and to defeat the sacramental party. The Virginia conference was regular. The Delaware conference was irregular. When that is said, the constitutional question has been exhausted. Some historians have referred to the Virginians as schismatics. That is an anachronism, a prejudice. Asbury's conference can be justified only by the logic of a successful revolution. It was the self-vindicating expedient of a seer and a mastery of men. 16 preachers constituted the Delaware Conference. They agreed to acknowledge the authority of Asbury as general assistant, accept the appointments made by him, and remain in connection with Mr. Wesley. William Waters, the head of the governing committee appointed in 1777, and who had presided in Leesbury, rode from his station in northern Virginia to attend this conference and to urge Asbury to attend the regular session in Virginia. That he had been privy to Asbury's plans is proved by the fact that he took an appointment to Baltimore and thus formally separated himself from his colleagues in the South. A soft and healing epistle was written the Virginians, begging them to desist from their contemplated course. This epistle rested the case for a year. Thus fortified, with an organized conference behind him, and with his authority as Mr. Wesley legate revived, Asbury awaited the issue of events. The regular conference met at the appointed time. William Waters was present, but did not preside. That responsibility fell to Philip Gatch, whose name stood second on the governing committee. The conference promptly entered upon a policy of independency, a resolve to constitute a presbytery for the decent ordination of a ministry. This presbytery consisted of 3 members, with Philip Gatch at its head. The members were authorized to administer the sacraments and to convey by ordination like an authority to others whom they deemed worthy. The war of the Revolution had now reached its most tragic state. Direct communication with England had long been at an end. The spiritual destitution of the country was great. The priests of the established church had nearly all deserted their cures. The preachers in the Virginia Conference were, without exception, Americans. The call to do what they did seemed imperative. They were the children of gospel expediency, and they followed the law of their being. Well, whether you accept a spiritual law from some external source or not, it's, it's what you've made your own law, your own system of judgment. By action of the conference, the societies were erected into a Presbyterian church. The breach with the Northern Conference was there, to all appearances complete. Satisfied with what they had done, the Virginia itinerants went forth to their societies, suddenly raised to the status of Christian churches, and began to baptize their converts and give to their congregations the bread and wine of the Holy Supper. The wrongness of this course was wholly in its inexpediency. It was legal, it was canonical, it was scriptural, but it was a course unadvisedly taken. The time selected was not that appointed of Providence. It failed in the end, and failed logically. The people received the ordinances gladly, and in the face of the fact that the war was at its tragic height, the revival in Virginia continued. The increase in membership in these parts during a period beginning with January 1779 was phenomenal. Not unnaturally, these tokens were accepted by both preachers and people as an endorsement by Providence of the sacramental departure. Asbury passed the remainder of the year in great activity. In study and travel, he fairly eclipsed his former record. Though his circuit lay wholly within the state of Delaware, his condition, too, was much ameliorated. New and strong friends had come to his aid, amongst them the governor of Delaware, under whose protection he had placed himself. He also found in Delaware another American Fletcher, in the person of Reverend Mr. McGraw of the established church, who, like Jarrat, had aligned himself with the Methodists and became their defender. A continuous revival went on here as well, and the number of communicants in the church greatly increased, for the Delaware Methodists considered themselves Episcopalians. Asbury constantly indulged the hope that the Southern societies would, at the end of the year, make overtures for an agreement and union with the societies in the North. This hope came of his own knowledge of the preachers, and was stimulated by letters which he received from individual itinerants in the South. Events showed that he had not wholly mistaken his brethren, but the task of reconciliation proved greater than he calculated. The Northern Conference had adjourned to meet in Baltimore April 25th, 1780. Asbury rode thither, crossing over to Maryland soil for the first time in more than 2 years. A passport from the governor of Delaware secured him safe conduct, but in Maryland he was a non-juror and could not preach. His presidency over the conference was not interdicted, but as a prophet or minister he dared not speak. Under this constrained silence, his spirit chafed. But it was a consequence of war. Get a rumbling and tumbling. As had been anticipated, a letter came from the Virginia Methodists. This letter was delivered by messengers empowered to treat. Several proposals were made by Asbury, but were rejected by the messengers. At last, Asbury suggested a suspension of the administration of the ordinances for 1 year, and an appeal to Wesley, with union and cooperation. In the meantime, the messengers thought this might do, and agreed to bear the offer to their brethren. Asbury, Garrison, and Waters were appointed to visit the Virginians as commissioners from the northern body. The Southern Conference was to meet at Brokenback Church in Manikintown, Virginia, May 9th, 1780, in company with Garrison and Waters. Asbury started thither about the 1st of May. Having perfected his American citizenship papers, he had the great joy during his southward journey to preach to his former parishioners in Baltimore. In due time, he and his fellow commissioners arrived at the seat of the Virginia Conference. Being invited to come before the conference, Asbury read Mr. Wesley's thoughts against the separation from the Church of England, together with a letter received by him at some earlier date from Mr. Wesley on the same subject. He also discussed the proposals made to the Southern messengers at Baltimore 2 weeks before. He did not speak forensically or in the spirit of the demand, but in tones of persuasiveness and love. The effect of his address was so nearly a healing of the difference that the preachers agreed to suspend the administrations on the grounds that Asbury should supply the ordinances to the circuits. This, however, he could not do, and so the matter rested for the time. Asbury closed the morning session of the conference with a sermon which melted many hearts. The way to an understanding seemed to have opened afresh, but at the afternoon session the prospect had departed. Asbury then renewed the proposal to suspend the administrations pending an appeal to Wesley, after which he and his companions withdrew, that the conference might have freedom of discussion. Repairing to his lodgings nearby, Asbury fell upon his face in prayer. It was an hour of agony and loud crying for the healing at the heart of Zion. The hour having expired, the commissioners were recalled to receive the answer of the conference. The terms of the union could not be accepted. The close of negotiations was abrupt enough. The commissioners now prepared to return to their stations in the north. Asbury went again to his lodgings to take final leave of his host, but once more in his chamber he fell upon his face and prayed, as with a broken heart. Earthly help was gone, but the man of many and mighty prayers laid hold upon the feet of power. Mounting his horse, he rode away, but alighted at the place where the conference was being held to say farewell to those who had chosen to reject his counsel. What was his joy and surprise if a man of such faith as his could be surprised of heaven to find that while he and his companions had been praying, the conference had accepted his terms. The administration of the ordinances was to be suspended, and there was to be but one conference. Surely the hand of God has been greatly seen in all this, was the calmly grateful speech which Asbury indulged in, reflecting on the fruitful end of his labors and prayers. To consummate the act of union, the commissioners were seated in the conference. Asbury assumed the chair and stationed the preachers. He was also requested by the conference action to take general oversight of the work and communicate with Mr. Wesley in the name of the reunited societies.